up, my miners of intelligence and consciousness? I'm Rick Brooks, and this is Rick's Mind. Today with me, I have Ivan Katchanovski, who is an expert on Russian and Eurasian studies and a professor of political studies at the University of Ottawa. Ivan, welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be on this show.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I think in issues as complex as this, the best way that I like to start is to ask you a little bit about your background. So, like, if you could tell our listeners where you're from, and I think, kind of how you got interested in political science, I think that that'd be a good place for us to start. And then from there, we can kind of tackle the giant elephant in the room.
I'm originally from Ukraine, from western part of Ukraine, which is close to Poland. And gladly, there is no war there yet. So this is like a kind of a little bit positive, or relatively positive development, if you can say this, because it's huge kind of negative war taking place, which has negative consequences for a lot of Ukrainians. But I'm originally from Western Ukraine, and I studied in the United States. I got my PhD in the US, and afterwards I did research on different topics, and I specialized in politics and conflicts in Ukraine. I wrote my dissertation on this topic and published books and articles in academic journals, and still working now on books about Ukraine, in particular on the war between Russia and Ukraine and other conflicts like Maidan Massacre in Ukraine. And I held various academic positions at various universities in the US, State University of New York in Potsdam, at Harvard University. I was a visiting scholar. I was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Library of Congress at the Kluge Center. And I also did my postdoctoral position at fellowship position, research position at the University of Toronto, and now I am based at the University of Ottawa in Canada. And I began interested in politics when I was a child. I wanted to study politics because this was a very important issue. You have Cold War, and I wanted basically to kind of to become a kind of professor of political science or international relations because of the conflict, because of the Cold War, and because of experience of my parents and grandparents. My mother, she told me about how she grew up and so on. She never moved from any place on her own, but she lived in 5 different countries without moving on her own because of politics, because of World War II, because of like Nazi occupation of Poland. Then it was Poland, then it was occupied by Nazi Germany, then she was expelled to the Soviet Union, to Soviet Ukraine, and then you have independent Ukraine. So this is just a different, and there was also Polish government after World War II. So you have different countries basically with different languages and so on. And I grew up becoming interested in politics and in conflicts, and that's why I research professionally conflicts in Ukraine and politics in Ukraine. And now this became very important issue, not only to people who do this, for scholars who do this, but also for many people in the world, because this is, I think, number one issue now.
It definitely is, and I just didn't. If you would have asked me before this all went down, I didn't think it was going to happen. We had the annexation of Crimea, and I don't remember the date, but what was it, like 2014, 2015 that
Yes.
Russia annexed Crimea, and it's not a region of the world that I'm super in tune with. I know a lot of it's past history, but not so much the modern. Then there was the was it the Euro-Maidan? Was it the Euro-Maidan? I remember that was a protest where they ousted the other president. So I remember that, and I think that, and we'll get to, was that backed by the U.S.? Was that caused by the U.S. Later down the line? But I think a good place to go from here is, how does something like this happen? I mean, in your opinion, your expert opinion, how does something like this happen, and how much of this is, on the United States. We have a history of a pretty shitty foreign policy. I feel like we've missed the mark a lot. So I'm curious to know, how much did we play a role in this happening, or what were the warning signs that we potentially missed? I'm sure you're going to bring up the Minsk agreement, but I just kind of want to get your perspective on that.
So this is exact question which I'm researching now for a book which I'm writing or finishing now about the origins of this conflict and different aspects of this conflicts in Ukraine which took place, starting with Maidan Massacre, the annexation of Crimea by Russia, the war in Donbas, or civil war in Donbas, and Russian military interventions in Donbas since 2014, and the current war between Russia and Ukraine, which is culmination of these different conflicts which started in 2014 with the Maidan, and in particular with the Maidan Massacre. So this is a book manuscript which I already received invitation to submit my proposal from the U.S. academic press. So I hope to finish this soon, and I'm going to be presenting this on this very topic at the American Political Science Association annual meeting in Montreal in Canada, actually, in September. So this is based on my research. And I can say this is like a most important issue. So I do not yet have all the evidence to say it, because this is still part of research. And not all the evidence is available, but the conflict, again, which is currently going on in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, goes back to the Maidan and to the violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government by the means of the Maidan massacre of the police and Maidan protesters. And this massacre was crucial. The start of this conflict. It became a turning point in Ukrainian politics, but also this massacre led to violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government, which was relatively pro-Russian in terms of orientation, and this led to a response by Russia, which when Russia escalated this conflict and annexed Crimea region in southern Ukraine, which was part of Ukraine, but was populated by ethnic Russians. And afterwards, it started also to support separatists, pro-Russian separatists in Donbas. And finally, it drastically escalated this conflict by invading Ukraine in 2022. And in my interviews, media interviews, and in my publications, including in the United States, popular publications, I predicted that this can happen, that the war between Russia and Ukraine can happen. There was a very strong possibility or real possibility of this war. So I tried to prevent this, basically just because I researched this. So I saw this basically becoming a very dangerous situation, and it was possible to avoid this war and to prevent it. But unfortunately, this did not happen. And so now I think important to understand how this happened. And that's why I'm researching this issue, in particular, role of different political actors, different countries in this conflict. And I'm looking into the role of the United States as well, and in different conflicts, including the war between Russia and Ukraine, but also in because this is also became a proxy war between the Western, and in particular the United States and Russia in Ukraine, but also I'm looking into the Maidan massacre, who was responsible for this, and how this massacre led to the violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government, and what this actually was from a political science perspective, and evidence. Was this a revolution? Was it a coup? Was this a regime change led by the United States? So based on my current research and current evidence, I can say there are different elements of all this taking place. So there were the elements of far-right-led revolution in Maidan. During Maidan, there are also evidence of oligarchic coup during Maidan in 2014, but also there is certain evidence of the United States-led regime change. So it's not yet clear which one was most important, but because a lot of evidence is not yet public, in particular, a lot of documents from the U.S. government, which can shed a role on the U.S. Any kind of involvement in this, are still not publicly available. So I think this is very important to know what actually happened and who actually was responsible for these events. But I think there is evidence of the United States involvement in this Maidan-led violent overthrow of the Ukrainian government, because the U.S. government supported this publicly, and there are also other evidence. There is no evidence of direct involvement of the U.S. in the Maidan massacre, but there was a testimony or interview by two leaders of far-right political party called Svoboda. And they gave interview to Ukrainian journalists in their book. This Ukrainian journalist said that these two leaders of far-right party, which was originally a neo-Nazi party, they said that they met along with other Maidan leaders. They met with representative of the West, and they did not name any country, specific country, but it was very likely the United States, because this representative was speaking on behalf of all Western countries. So this only one country can do this, and they basically discussed how Western governments can change their policy towards recognition of the existing then government of Viktor Yanukovych, and they basically discussed how many people need to be killed for the West to stop recognizing the Yanukovych government. And Maidan leaders mentioned like 5 people killed, 20. They said not enough. Western representative told this was not enough. If there would be 100 people killed then on Maidan, then the US and other governments, basically the Western governments, would change the recognition of the Yanukovych government and would support Maidan opposition. And this is exactly what happened. After Maidan Massacre on February 20th, there was close to 100 Maidan protesters killed during this very violent event, and immediately on this, after this massacre took place, like within hours, there was a name for these protesters who were killed. They were called Heavenly Handed, and so this has become a very kind of widely kind of mentioned name of protesters, Heavenly Handed, who were killed, even so they were not exactly 100, but very close to 100, and many of them, or some of them, were not even killed during the Maidan, but they were included as a part of these victims in order to create like Heavenly Handed. And immediately after the Maidan massacre, without any investigation, the U.S. government and other Western governments stopped recognizing Yanukovych government, and they supported opposition. They recognized new government of the Maidan, which was led by the Maidan opposition, including far-right parties, including from Svoboda. So this is just one evidence of the U.S. involvement or Western government involvement in this regime change. And even then President Obama, when he gave interview after the Maidan took place, he said that U.S. administration, his administration, was involved in arranging a transition of power in Ukraine during the Maidan. So he also said that there was U.S. involvement, but he did not specify what kind of involvement was. But I think this is very important to say that this was not only a Ukrainian kind of led event, but there was United States involvement. And after the Maidan massacre, after the new government came to power as a result of Maidan massacre, Ukraine became what I call a U.S. client state, because U.S. government became very strongly involved in Ukrainian politics and policy and key decisions by Ukrainian government, like not to resist Russia, to annex Crimea. This was done by basically because the U.S. government U.S. government officials told Ukrainian government officials what to do and what not to do. And in specifically about Minsk agreements, this was U.S. government officials who said to Zelensky and to Poroshenko that these agreements should not be implemented. And they basically, Ukrainian government followed this again, because Ukraine became very dependent on the United States. And U.S. government, in particular, then Vice President Biden, who was before he was elected president of U.S., he was vice president of the United States under Obama administration, and he was responsible for relations with Ukraine. And so he was very active in 2014 in all these events, and specifically after new government was formed, he became involved in deciding or supporting who would become prime minister of Ukraine, who should be dismissed, and who would be nominated. So this kind of another illustration that U.S. plays very strong influence in the Ukrainian politics after the Maidan, and the same concerns as the same applies to current war between Russia and Ukraine.
Wow, I understood it at I thought a little deeper level than most people, but you went very granular there, and that was a lot of information. And thank you for sharing. But those some, I mean, I wouldn't call them accusations, right? Like that you have the documents that you've read, but that is wild. And just so the folks that aren't as familiar, the Maidan Massacre is essentially where the protesters were protesting in the Maidan Square, correct? Am I correct with that? And there were snipers that just started shooting people. And I don't think they ever caught any of the snipers, correct? Like that, no one was ever found out. They don't know where they came from, and it was super fishy. And you were saying that you'd found a document that said how many people need to die at this protest in order for the West to back us. Just like really quick catch up, make sure everyone's following along. Is that a pretty good assumption of a very shortened version of what you were saying?
Yes, there were like interviews by two leaders of Maidan in the Ukrainian book, which is published in Ukrainian, and I cited this in my studies. In addition to this, I did research about Maidan Massacre, who was responsible, who actually committed this mass murder, and this is again published in peer-reviewed journals, presented in U.S. conferences, academic conferences, published in books. So my research is academic one, but I found a lot of evidence, which is I think overwhelming, without any doubt. I can say that this massacre was conducted in front of thousands of people, like witnesses, in front of hundreds of journalists from different countries, including the United States, like CNN footage, like BBC, all this major NBC and CBS. I checked their footage, I searched their footage and videos about Maidan Massacre live film during this massacre. So all this evidence shows that this massacre was not conducted by government snipers or not by the police, which were tied for the massacre, but still there is nobody convicted for this mass murder. But this was conducted by snipers who were located in Maidan control buildings, and specifically they killed and wounded both police and Maidan protesters in order to falsely blame government forces, to falsely blame government snipers in order to delegitimize, basically to say that they were responsible, that this was massacre on orders from the Yanukovych government, and this led to his overthrow because he was removed by the parliament and he was blamed for the massacre. And the West, basically including the United States, stopped to recognize him as the president of Ukraine. And then Biden, in his memoirs, he says that when the massacre happened, just immediately after this, he called Yanukovych and told Yanukovych that he basically needs to leave Ukraine because he needs to leave presidency of Ukraine, and he has to leave Ukraine as well. So this is just kind of without any investigation. This was again immediately blamed on Yanukovych. Even so, all the evidence, which is not only evidence which is publicly available, which I collected, like hundreds of testimonies, more than 500 witness testimonies about snipers, videos of snipers. There is also evidence from Maidan Massacre trial and investigation, which is publicly available. I posted on my YouTube page. There are testimonies of absolute majority of Maidan protesters who were wounded during this massacre. And they testified that they were wounded not by the police who are charged with this massacre or any government snipers. They testified that they were wounded and shot from locations of Maidan controlled buildings in the back and in the side. So this is consistent with forensic medical examinations, with testimonies of dozens of prosecution witnesses, with admissions by 14 members of Maidan sniper groups. In public, they publicly admitted. Some of them were Georgian snipers. They said they received order from Maidan leadership to massacre both police and protesters in order to kind of create chaos and to overthrow Yanukovych government. This was successfully done, and evidence is just overwhelming. I published this evidence, but the issue is that media never reported this. So it's like people who have no idea. They read like New York Times or Washington Post or BBC. They watch like all the television networks in the US. They just have image that this was done by the Yanukovych government, by the police. Even so, there is nobody basically charged with this, nobody convicted for this massacre, and the trial is still ongoing. But all the evidence shows that that this massacre was not conducted by government snipers, but was conducted by the opposition snipers, including from far right organizations like Svoboda and the right sector.
So, and when I want to be very, very clear with our listeners, you are not pro-Russian at all. You've been on record many, many times saying that this is an illegal invasion. It is a violation of international law, but you are just presenting the evidence as where it points to, right? Like this is just you're stating facts. Like this wasn't this. There's a lot of shady shit going on, and you're presenting that. But I mean, just you're definitely you're not pro-Russian. You are, but you're also a historian in a certain context, and it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the democracy Ukraine has never really actually had a democracy. It has generally been more along the lines of what's set up in Russia, correct? It's oh man, I can't think of it. It's not a junta. That's in South America. It's not coming to me. But Russia is not, or Ukraine is generally the governmental structures of Ukraine. Like, how does it? John, go ahead.
Do you mean oblast?
Yeah, no, blast. Yeah, I think so. Is that the type of government it was before they overthrew the character in 2014?
So I study this issue as well, about the issue if Ukraine is democracy or not. And I can say again, based on my research, not again, this is not any politics. I have nothing to do with Russia, and I supported democracy since I was a student in Ukraine. So I actually went to the first demonstration, pro-democracy, anti-Soviet demonstration in 1988, when there was still Soviet Union, and there were just few dozen people on this demonstration, which was in Kiev, downtown Kiev. So I was the one who actually attended basically the first public illegal demonstration against the Soviet Union, and I have nothing to do with Russia. I always supported Western style democracy in Ukraine, but unfortunately, according to my research, Ukraine is not a democracy; it's largely undemocratic. So, in terms of form of the government, Ukraine is actually very closely to Russia. It's mostly undemocratic government. And Zelensky is not a Democrat, as he shown by the Western media. He's actually basically now closed all the opposition parties. Basically, he banned all the opposition parties. He just allowed one television channel, which all the television channels, basically news channels in Ukraine, just show one content, which is pro-Zelensky content. So they have just one program, like only one news program, or the same news program, or all television channels. So this is just one television show. So you can imagine if this would be like Fox News, would be translated on CNN and MSNBC, and would be supporting basically Donald Trump, or like CNN content would be supported, would be shown by all other television stations when Biden was president. So there would be no opposition at all. Just everything would be pro-government, and this is what happened now. So Zelensky basically, and he even accused all his opposition, leaders of opposition, basically being Russian agents and committing state treason, and charged them with state treason. So basically, that's why there is no real opposition now in Ukraine, and I think this makes Ukraine very similar now to Russia. And Zelensky wants to be a new kind of Putin. This is, I think, his goal, and continue to his public image, and all this his public relations campaign, which is very successful because he is by his professional occupation, he is a very good actor. He was in industry, entertainment industry, but he's not a very democratic politician, to say this much.
You're blowing my mind. I didn't know what we were gonna get into, and there's so many things I'm learning right now. I had no idea that I didn't know he had grabbed so much power during this and he's completely backed by the West right now, and he's almost being used as a pawn in this giant, in the geopolitical sense. Like I mean, for the images that we are getting back in the States is that like this is like the the great man theory of history. Like, this is a man that, like, somehow over all the odds got elected. He was an actor on a famous, like, a comedian. He's a comedian that became president, and then all the world turned against him and his country, and he's rallied the troops, and he's holding off this Eastern advance from the Red Army, so to speak, right? That's how I would sell this. And it's interesting to hear a different, maybe an unbiased perspective of actually what's going on, because none of us are there. During the initial push of the Russian forces, I'm a military history nut, so I was freaking out and watching way too much battle footage and just like getting way too engrossed in this. But the one thing that I didn't do is I started researching it, and I realized how incredibly nuanced this was, and that there is a different perspective. There is the Russian perspective. And, I don't know if we are even talking to them, which I think is, hopefully we are. We're still able to communicate, and you can answer that a little in a second. But what I started to realize is that from their perspective, the United States has, from their perspective, they've had an open hand toward us for years, and we've kind of slapped it away. And granted, they've done terrible things, and as have we, but they wanted to join NATO at one point. We said no. During the reunification of Germany deal, part of the deal was that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. We said yes, and then we lied, and we added a few countries into the NATO bloc, which they feel like is threatening their borders. The line that they drew essentially was Ukraine, and there's a lot of countries that I'm leaving out just because I have a terrible memory today. But from their perspective, like, they've always been like, we want to be your friends, or we feel like we want to be your friends, but you guys always have us as an enemy. And Ukraine, as they started to draw closer to the West, to me, the way I looked at it is if China wanted to build a base in Mexico, we wouldn't let it happen. And I feel like that's my perspective of it. That's my understanding of it. And I'm curious to get your thoughts as to if I'm way off base, or if I'm getting close to hitting a home run here.
Yeah, I think this is very close to home run, but I can say this is more precisely, it would be a similar situation to Canada and the US.
Yeah.
Because of close historical ties, not only just geographic location, but very close historical and ties. So they used to be one country, and like Canada and the United States, basically before independence, US independence. But
yep.
In terms of history, before they became independent, but and Canada would be a kind of very similar kind of relationship as Ukraine to Russia.
Okay.
So as Canada to the United States, and I mentioned this also in my interviews, and this is also important because I research, another area of my research is United States and Canada, comparing US and Canada. So this is kind of also related, and I can say this is an important issue about actually Russian invasion, because obviously this is illegal invasion. It's not justified by any kind of pretext which was given by Putin in invading Ukraine. It was illegal under international law, and claims by Putin that Ukraine is going to become member of NATO in the near future, would become a base for military missiles or weapons from the West. Were not supported by any evidence. I do not think that there was likely that Ukraine had any chances of becoming NATO member in the foreseeable future, in part because NATO did not want to have any conflict with Russia or war with Russia, and that's why they oppose even now membership of Ukraine, because this would mean war with nuclear Russia. And also there were no Nazis in the Ukrainian government, so claim by Putin that this is denazification is also kind of based on misrepresentation, and his claim that there is a genocide of Russians or ethnic Russian speakers, or ethnic Russians or Russian speakers in Ukraine, in Donbas, also is not supported by evidence. And this is, I wrote about this in my studies, and I talked about this publicly. So there was no such justification for Russian invasion. But this does not mean that Russia did not regard Ukraine as as possibly a military threat and political threat to Russia, as similarly what happened with Caribbean missile crisis, when when the Soviet Union used Cuba to deploy nuclear weapons, so they believe there was such possibility, so they claim this as also justification for this invasion because this can happen in the future. So they believe this might happen, and also they say that this is Ukraine basically was used as a tool against Russia, and now when the United States basically uses Ukraine and other Western countries use Ukraine as to wage a proxy war with Russia. So this is actually Russian government says basically this is what they wanted. They were concerned about because this is like testimony that their claims that the West is only interested in using Ukraine as a tool against Russia is now kind of backed by a policy of the US by giving weapons, basically by using Ukraine to fight Russia without actually deploying US military or NATO military forces in Ukraine, but giving weapons and giving like intelligence and other support, money basically for the government and so on. So that's why I think kind of pretext for invasion was illegal, and invasion was illegal, but this does not mean that there was no way to avoid this. It was possible to avoid this war between Russia and Ukraine, and I mentioned specifically in my interviews and in my publications before this war was launched by Russia, I said that there was such possibility, for instance, by Ukraine becoming a neutral country. So there was no possibility of NATO membership of Ukraine, even so such membership was mentioned as a possibility by NATO in 2008. But this means it was very easy for Ukraine to abandon this goal of NATO membership and become a neutral country and accept kind of Minsk agreement to accept basically autonomy of Donbas, and this would mean that this would basically mean that Russia would no longer have any pretext for invasion of Ukraine and would accept this in order to prevent such a war between Russia and Ukraine from a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And also I said that in exchange for this, Ukraine could be offered a prospect of becoming a member of the European Union in the future if it would fulfill all the criteria like democracy and human rights and so on. But unfortunately, this did not happen, and now I think it will be very difficult to have a peaceful resolution to this conflict because now this war is going for a long time and there are a lot of casualties in Ukraine, devastation to Ukraine, and if the war would continue, it would have even much more negative impact on Ukraine, and I don't think that a peaceful resolution is now very likely unless there would be any significant change in the military outcome of this war.
We're getting to a point where too much blood is being shed, but I do want to push back on something. You did mention that there was no evidence for like a genocide towards Russian speakers in, I believe, the Donbas region, correct?
Yes.
But I am curious because it's my understanding that there were laws passed to kind of get rid of the Russian language, right? Which could be a bit of an aggressor. Language is very, very important. Your home country of Canada, they have laws in Quebec that it's illegal, I believe, to not teach French. So that's a very, very important language. Is very, very important. The second thing I want to know is there any credence to the Russian claims that Ukraine was shelling Donbas? Because there was, I believe, a separatist movement, and then also it's like a 3-part question. How deep is this separatist movement in those regions, Donbas and Luhansk? Is it as widespread as the Russian propaganda machine wants to make it, or is it as faint as the West? It's probably somewhere in the middle, but I'm kind of curious. So just kind of to reiterate it, was Donbas shelled by the Ukrainian government? Were there laws passed against Russian language speakers, and how deep is this so-called separatist movement, or is there one?
Yes, I researched all these issues, and I can say that there was shelling of Donbas by the Ukrainian forces since 2014, when the civil war started. And this war was started not accidentally; it started in Donbas, because I published my book about regional conflicts and divisions in Ukraine in 2006, before this conflict started, in which I said that there was a real possibility that Ukraine could face a breakup of a country, basically separatist division in Ukraine, in particular by looking to separatist two regions in Ukraine which I identified were Crimea and Donbas. Based on my research, based on public opinion surveys, which show that there was absolute majority support for joining Russia in Crimea. In the 1990s, it became smaller when Yanukovych was elected, but still very significant, and majority supported joining Russia after the Maidan, when there were laws adopted against Russian language and new government came to power which was anti-Russian. So the similar situation happened in Donbas. So in Donbas, I mentioned this separatist, that this was separatist region, significant support for separatism even before Maidan. After the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was a significant support for separatism in Donbas and in addition to Crimea. And the same happened after the first Maidan in 2004, when also pro-Russian government was basically replaced after they attempted to falsify election results, and they were based in this region. And Yanukovych in particular, was not elected president, and he was actually, and other politicians that supported separatism or autonomy for this region. And after the Maidan happened, I conducted actually a survey. I commissioned a survey in Ukraine from a company which is most reputable company, sociological company in Ukraine, Kyiv Institute of International Sociology, International Sociology Institute, and they conducted this survey for my research project, which I published in Washington Post and presented in American Political Science Association conference and published in a book and in as article in peer-reviewed journal, which actually was the most cited article on the civil war in Donbas in Google Scholar. So this is just based on this survey, I can say that there was a significant support, majority support for separatism in Donbas. So, but different forms of separatism. Not all of them supported joining Russia. Some supported independence of Donbas, and many Ukrainians in Donbas supported autonomy of this region within Ukraine. So this means there was public support for separatism in Donbas, even so this was denied by media, by politicians. There was clear evidence that Donbas was the only region in Ukraine, with the exception of Crimea, that had a majority support for separatism in different forms of separatism in this region. All other regions of Ukraine had minority support of separatism. So that's why Donbas, it was not accidental that the war took place. And shelling of Donbas happened, and most active fighting in Donbas happened in 2014 and 2015 between separatists, and most of them were local citizens. I also collected all the data, but there were also Russian volunteers. But in addition to this, they obviously could not match Ukrainian military forces. Ukrainian military came very close to capturing, basically defeating all the separatist forces in summer of 2014. But then Russia deployed covertly their military to Donbas to support separatists. They did not recognize this publicly, but all the evidence suggests that there were Russian military forces. Just several battalions, maybe a few thousand Russian military forces. They were able to, again, push back Ukrainian forces and kill many Ukrainian soldiers and members of paramilitary battalions and far-right-led battalions, and they were able basically to to establish de facto independence of Donbas separatist regions. But they were not recognized by Russia, because Russia still publicly recognized them as a Ukrainian part of Ukraine, but it supported separatists. And after a second attempt by the Ukrainian forces to capture Donbas in 2015, Russia again deployed military forces covertly and was able to encircle Ukrainian forces. And after this, Ukrainian government had to sign Minsk agreements, in which they basically agree under pressure from Russia, military pressure from Russia, after a result of basically defeat from Russia, military defeat, they sign agreement to basically give autonomy to Donbas and de facto independence of Donbas within Ukraine. So basically Donbas would become a region with their own government, with their own militia, basically their own prosecutor, justice system and so on, but still nominally within Ukraine. So this was a possible way to resolve this conflict. And Zelensky, when he came to power, he was elected basically on peace, promise of peaceful resolution of this conflict. So he said that he would go to Russia to meet with anybody just to make peace in Ukraine, and he was elected mostly by people who were from eastern Ukraine, and for southern Ukraine, many of whom were pro-Russian, not actually supporting joining Russia, but they wanted to have better relations with Russia, and they voted to him, and he got elected against the former president Poroshenko, who was very kind of hardline, nationalistic, very kind of belligerent, supporting war with Russia and so on, kind of using all this language. Ukraine, Zelensky was actually opposite. He basically said that it's necessary to respect all languages, Russian language. It's necessary to have peace with Russia. So this actually election was giving hope that the Ukraine might have again possible the resolution of this conflict. And afterwards, there was a meeting between Zelensky and Putin with leaders of France and Germany I think in Paris, in which there was agreement basically to try to defuse this conflict and implement Minsk agreement, there was a dispute between how to implement this, and basically Zelensky and Putin agreed that there would be a withdrawal of military from front line in order to defuse, to avoid shelling of these forces. It was agreed that Ukrainian forces would be and separatist forces would be withdrawn from their line of combat, and this led to reduction of shelling for 1 year or maybe 2 years. But then Zelensky changed his position. He became again very radical. He started to advocate for military takeover on Donbas, and this happened after he visited Donbas and far-right or neo-Nazi organization linked to Azov told him basically that they would not leave this region. They threatened him that he would be dismissed from president, or even he would be killed if there would be peace with Russia. So he had to change his policy. He became this kind of new Poroshenko, very kind of anti-Russian, and starting to support not only kind of military takeover of Donbas by force, but also military takeover of Crimea, which was annexed by Russia. So this led to intensification of conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia supported separatists, even so there were no separatist military forces in Donbas until 2022, and with the exception of these two short Russian military interventions in 2014 and 2015. And there was increased shelling shortly before the war started, but the shelling of Donbas was not comparable in any form or in scope to what happened in 2014 and 2015. So there was increase in shelling, but there was no evidence that Ukrainian forces wanted to again capture Donbas or take it back from separatists or from supported by Russia. Even so, the Russian government claims that there was such evidence. There is no such evidence, which I examined, or reliable evidence. And shelling was significant, but it was not comparable to what was before, and in no way comparable to what happened after the Russian invasion of Donbas, because now Donbas is the main area of battle between Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, that's. But I mean, just the him going down there, meeting with those people, and then trying to get it back, and then shelling. That's not the best political move, right? If you're trying to make peace, but it's I'm confused by that, right? Like why start doing that? Does that make sense to you?
Yes, because he basically Zelensky, he's I think what I call him is a weak president. He's not. He just plays very strong president because he was elected after he became very popular on Ukrainian television after the television show in which he played a very kind of strong president, which he now became basically after or tries to present himself after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, basically supporting ordinary people, becoming very tough. Again, and so on. So he now this basically the same Zelensky who played such president in this fictional movie, which got him elected as president of Ukraine. But in fact, he was very weak, and even kind of as a leader, because he was elected not only by his own based on his own popularity. He was promoted by oligarch, who was a very powerful oligarch who owned television channel in which this television show was shown. And Zelensky was basically backed by oligarch, to presidency of Ukraine. So he was already a kind of client of this oligarch. So he was elected to basically not only again become president, but also to support economic interests of this oligarch who had the problems. And he actually recently even investigated in the United States for corruption. By he bought a lot of property from money from his bank, which he laundered from Ukraine in Cleveland and in Texas. He bought a lot of like factories, buildings, and steel mills and so on in Texas and in Cleveland, in Ohio. And now FBI investigated him. So he was in very hot water, but basically he he supported Zelensky, and Zelensky became his president. But after election, Zelensky became actually more influenced by the United States and also by far right. So who threatened him publicly if he would make a deal with Russia. So he basically caved to such pressure, and that's why he's not very strong, because if he was a leader of Ukraine, he would just do this, even because he had popular mandate. He had 73% support of Ukrainians, but he basically was threatened, and he felt that it's more dangerous to oppose far right, who could have shot him or just tried to overthrow him. And there was a real possibility of this because they attacked his office. They put a swastika on his office just 1 year ago. And this was again they threatened him publicly to harm him in Kiev if he would make a deal with Russia. So this is done openly without any consequences. And basically, police stood by. The police stood by, and so this means few thousand people who have no power, like they are not elected, but they have power basically to overthrow Ukrainian president. And this is why this was very dangerous. And the U.S. government also did not, because U.S. government had very strong influence on Zelensky, and they could tell him basically to try to make a peace deal, but they told him opposite. And when this impeachment happened in the United States, there was a very famous case of a phone call between Donald Trump and Zelensky. Mm-hmm. And what surprised a lot of people actually when this in Ukraine, when this phone call transcript was released, that Zelensky became in his phone call, he was again very deferent to Trump. So he will like say all this trying to please Trump. So this was not like talk between two leaders of countries, but Zelensky was basically trying to do this all this to please Trump by giving him everything like and saying all that he regarded Trump as the greatest politician and so on. This is like all this talk basically trying to be liked by Trump and not to be a a leader and preserve this independence. And that's why this was shock to many people that Zelensky basically was trying to not be a real leader of Ukraine, but was trying to be liked by Trump and basically trying to please him in any way and form. And this happened the same with Biden when Biden was elected. So Zelensky tried to please him, and he one way to do this, he also closed opposition television channels, because they were supported by a relative Russian party, and Zelensky decided to please Biden by giving him present by closing opposition channels which were linked to Russian political party, which was relatively pro-Russian. They not supported Russian invasion, but they advocated closer relations with Russia and peace with Russia, which was considered then again basically a treason. And now this leader of this party is arrested by Zelensky and put in prison. So that's why
so any
this is why I'm saying I was telling my students even before this war started, I was saying to my students that Ukrainian politics is more interesting than Hollywood movies.
Yeah,
imagine this is like you watch this and this is like the reality of this television show.
It's like it's like the reality. So anytime someone has a little bit of common sense, there's like, all right, there's a way we can cut a deal to get us out of here and be free. Someone comes in and kind of fucks it up. There's like 17 different, you've got the far right, you got oligarchs, you've got people that are like, well, we kind of like Russia, let's keep them, let's get closer to them, and then also appease the West. You have a president that's weak, that's trying to please everybody, but he's kind of corrupted as well. So it's almost like the perfect storm of FUBAR, right? It's just it's not good. How do we get out of here? How do we cut a deal? You have the fighting's intensifying, and to be fair and to be honest with you, I was obsessed with this in the beginning. And it started to consume me and started to really pay, I feel, a little bit too much attention to this. And it's not good for my mental health, right? Like so I kind of have been dropping by, but is my understanding that the fighting is intensified. It's getting more bloody. I think the Russian advance has stalled to a certain degree. Am I correct in that assumption?
No, I think this is like Russia originally, I think to do this very fast. So they wanted they invaded Ukraine from different directions, and from the north in Kiev area, also from the south and from Donbas and Kharkiv area, from the east. And they specifically, I think their goal was not to capture Ukraine, not to occupy entire Ukraine, but to force a regime change from pro-Western government to pro-Russian government. And they wanted either to change the government. Basically, if the Ukrainian government, they expected maybe Zelensky would not fight because Russia has military advantage, so they maybe believe that his military would not fight, and they basically would be able to easily replace the government in Ukraine, in Kiev, with a set of Russian military forces nearby. Or they expected also that another alternative was that Zelensky would himself agree to demands by Russia to have neutral status for Ukraine, to basically give a Russian language official status, and to ban basically or kind of denazify Ukrainian politics, which again Russia uses this body, but basically this could have been done by limited far-right organizations and policies. So and basically Russia also demanded demilitarization of Ukraine and recognition of independence of Donbas within borders of Donbas. So this was an issue which was not accepted by Ukraine, but Zelensky initially kind of agreed to discuss these demands, and there was a real possibility of peace deal between Russia and Ukraine on not on all of these points, but Zelensky basically agreed for Ukraine to become neutral country, non-NATO membership, in exchange for guarantees from the Western countries and Russia that they would accept neutral status of Ukraine, there would be no invasion of Ukraine. So there was such possibility to do this and discuss the status of Donbas separately. But this agreement was broken after a visit by a British Prime Minister, who told Zelensky not to sign any peace deal with Russia. And Zelensky then changed this completely. And again, his policy became totally opposed to any peace deal. He believed that he could defeat Russia. And after this, and this happened, Russia withdrew their forces from Kyiv area, and this kind of northern part of Ukraine, and this was presented in the West as basically defeat of Russia, that Russian forces was defeated by Ukrainian forces. And I watched this again. I watched all the videos. I watched all the evidence, different sources, like hundreds of videos and reports from different sources. And this actually was not a military defeat of Russia. Russia obviously had opposition. There was significant fighting in Kyiv area. But Russia withdrew their forces not because of, again, Ukrainian counter-offensive in this region, but because I don't believe that they wanted to occupy this region, because this was not very pro-Russian region, it was anti-Russian region. So they, in contrast to other regions of Ukraine, they just want to put a pressure on Zelensky and his government, basically by not taking military force Kyiv, but basically trying to encircle or just pressure Zelensky. And when they failed to do this, they moved their forces from Crimea and from other regions of Ukraine to Donbas. So Donbas became now main area of battlefield, or main battlefield between Russia and Ukraine. And now Russian goal was to encircle Ukrainian forces in Donbas, and they started to do this, and they're doing this slowly. So there's a kind of not stalemate, but actually a slow advance by Russia, which is very gradual. But they managed to take already a large part of Donbas, and they do this again. Still have advance they still have advance, but very slow advance. But now they rely not on their tactic, which was used at the first days during the war when they just launched their forces in Ukraine. They kind of occupied a large part of Ukraine without much fighting before the fighting started near Kyiv and other regions. So they initially were able to take control of a large part of southern Ukraine, in Kherson region and so on. But in Donbas, there were much more kind of significant Ukrainian military presence forces because of the war between separatists and Ukrainian government for 8 years. So there was a very significant military presence of Ukraine, and forces there were most professional and most committed to fight with Russia, and they were all already built defensive positions. So now Russia relies not on their kind of all this kind of tactics which they tried to use in the first days of war. They now use artillery and heavy bombardment of these areas. So now there are very significant losses from Ukrainian forces there from artillery and bombardment by Russian forces each day. And Zelensky recently stated that there were each day in Donbas about 100 Ukrainian soldiers killed and 500 wounded each day, just in Donbas. And there are also significant Russian military casualties, but I don't think that they are similar to what all this media says or what the government forces say, but there are significant casualties. And now Russia tries to minimize the casualties by using their military, and bombardment, so they would just try to flatten all these areas in which they advance, and do this very slowly, but they are advancing in this area, and they are able to capture some towns in Donbas. In particular, they were able to capture Mariupol, which was the largest city and port city in southern Ukraine, which was located in Donbas. So there is a gradual still progress by Russia, and I think this means that Russia is still very likely to to have advance. They want to basically take control over all Donbas, not just regions which were controlled by separatists before this war, but entire territory of Donbas, and this is now their main goal. But if there would be no peace agreement, the Russian forces might, after the Donbas, after they would be able to defeat or take control over Donbas, occupy entire Donbas, they might go to other regions of Ukraine in the south, maybe Odessa, maybe Zaporizhia, if there would be no peace agreement. So, but this would be very difficult to do. But that's why I'm not sure. I think that Russians also might have preferred to have peace agreement. But now I think they plan to annex Donbas and other regions of Ukraine which are occupied by Russia, or which would be still occupied by Russia in the future if the war would continue.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I was wondering, because if peace, what's going on here is we got to make peace profitable. War is stupid. It's terrible. And we have to figure out a way to make this profitable, right? Like I think if Russia could get Ukraine not to join NATO and to be a neutral country, potentially, I mean, now they'd be like, you have to demilitarize because like we're at war and I don't like this. And we could technically want to win. Then I think we could stop the bloodshed. But if not, and I'm Putin, I mean, and also I'm a huge conquest person just because of the history. So that you take this I'm taking the whole thing, which would be incredibly expensive. And I don't know if Russia could, potentially pull that off or hold it. And you'd lose all, they've lost quite a bit of prestige in the international community because of this. But, let's not forget that the United States is just as guilty. Like the whole Iraq thing, that was definitely an invasion of a sovereign nation. We broke international law, and we did the same exact thing. We've done that hundreds of times. Maybe not hundreds of times. But we've done that quite a bit. So, it's a very complex issue. I really hope that the light bulbs will turn on in our leaders' heads, and we'll realize that we got to make peace profitable. It's been a long time since we've had two powers going at each other. And I mean, Russia is definitely a world power with a nuclear power. And I think that, and then the institutional memory of the World War II veterans is leaving us. And people don't spend a lot of time buried in textbooks about war. And I feel like we've forgotten that. And that is what scares me. We've also forgotten the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and how that devastated Japan, and the sheer heartbreak. You can read all about it. You can look at pictures. You can look at the Pacific campaigns of when we were island hopping, you look at the atrocities in the Vietnam War that were perpetrated by, our soldiers. We can look at you go down and war is terrible. It puts people in a terrible place and it scars them for life. And until we can figure out, how to talk to each other and how to honor what we mean, what we say what we mean, and honor the agreements that we put in place, I don't know if if we'll ever see an end to it. But I really appreciate the work that you've done in this, covering this history and the politics behind it, to shed some light as to which way people should have gone, which in the way things are going, and being able to foresee the beginnings of a war, right? Just in the language and in the papers and in what's going on. That is a very important gift that you're bringing to the public. And I really want to thank you. People like you are incredibly important. And the knowledge that you're, sharing with me, and can't say that I'm hopeful now. I don't know if I'm more hopeful than I was before, but it's an important message. And I want to be respectful of your time. Please tell people where they can buy your work. Where do you have? I think you got a Twitter. Share all of your social medias out, and then also, when can we expect the new book?
Thank you. So this was a very good conversation, and you know a lot of Ukraine about the war between Russia and Ukraine. So you have a lot of interest in this topic. So this questions were very good, and people who are interested in my books can find them on Amazon or any other online. I published another book about history of Ukraine by U.S. Academic Press, and about Canada and the United States as well. They are available on Amazon and different other places online. And my new book, I have one book which will be published by the U.S. Academic Press, but it will take a few years to publish this, because it's a general book about Ukraine. And another book, which is, I mentioned, about different conflicts in Ukraine, including the Russia-Ukraine war, would be available as soon as I would have my research about war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, completed, and then it will take some time to publish and so on. And finally, I also plan to publish a book about Maidan Massacre, because I have already completed all my research, and it's available also on my academic websites, which you can share about. My papers are available for free for download in my academic websites. And I have also a YouTube website which contains a lot of evidence, like testimonies and videos from the Maidan Massacre, and my interviews, television interviews and other interviews. So if people are interested, they can find this information. And my Twitter and Facebook accounts are also publicly available for anybody who would be interested.
We'll post all the links in the show notes. Ivan, thank you so much. As soon as the other book comes out, let us know. We'll get you on here again. And it's been a pleasure. And we'll talk to you later, my man. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.